one of the things I get asked about all the time regarding church music, and I deal with this with a lot of church musicians, is how do I change keys? From a pure functionality standpoint, changing keys in preludes is a big deal. We've all been in churches or even been that place where we just can't change keys, and so we try and bookend our preludes to use a functional 5/7 or something that just works, or we just stop and we turn the page and find something that we like, and then we go to the next one. But it's nice to be able to have that segue, if you will, to as an interlude to change from point A to point B. And so we learn to modulate. And when we first learned to modulate, we use the 5/7, right? Because that's the most basic way to get to another key. And the reason it works so well is because, if you're wondering, the 5/7 contains both tendency tones of your next keys. We all know that the 7th scale degree is a tendency tone. It wants to resolve up, but the often neglected tendency tone is the 4th scale degree, which wants to resolve down. So you put it in a 5/7, and 4 goes to 3, and 7 goes to 1, and you get this pull to the next key. And so we use that to change keys, the 5/7 to 1. Totally functional. It works great if I'm playing along in the key of C and I need to go to D flat, and everybody knows that we just changed keys. And so we start that way, and then we learn some tips and tricks. And I know those of us that have meandered through Crown College at a certain point in our lives have learned about the 4/5, where you've got that 4 chord in the right hand, and you've got the 5 octaves in your left hand, which, if you want to be super technical, is a 5/11. And it functions in that dominant fashion, and then it resolves to tonic, your new tonic. So you could be playing along and play your 4/5, resolve it to a 5/7, and you're in the next key. Very functional. However, it's not easily hidden. And so what I want to talk about tonight is, how can we mask, or how can we hide those modulations to where they become an integrated part of your arrangement, your accompaniment, whatever it happens to be, even your preludes, where you're just rolling along and you change keys, and then somebody looks back and goes, well, did we change keys, rather than, hold on a second while I change keys, which I've done numerous times. I do have to laugh whenever you're playing a prelude, somebody comes up and talks to you. I've literally turned to someone and said, hold on a second, I have to change keys. Because I can talk and play lots of things, but I can't talk and think in a new key. So I will hold them off, change keys, and then go back to my conversation. So we think through this process of changing keys, but usually when it comes to changing keys, we think about one thing and one thing only, and that's the harmonic progression. What chords do I need to get from point A to point B, to get from this key to that key? And that's a basic modulation. How do I get from key of C to the key of F, or the key of D flat to Jonathan's favorite key, the key of G flat? For some odd reason, that's his favorite key, has been since he was 8.
Amen.
Yeah, I know. I don't understand it. So that's the basic modulation. How do I get from this point to that point? But what is the advanced modulation? First of all, what is it not? Sometimes it's easier to describe what something isn't in an effort to determine what it is. And so I just wrote, a basic modulation is purely functional. It doesn't hide what you're trying to accomplish, but rather feels like that necessary commercial break in the story of the music. So if you're playing along, right? We all know exactly what just happened. I changed keys. I used the 4/5 followed by the 5. I did it in a 4 beat measure, and that serves a million purposes. In fact, I think sometimes there is a call for making your modulations obvious. I think of all those years of listening to the children's choirs down at Temple, that this is the segue between songs, and the kids begin to hear that, and they begin to understand, don't sing here, do sing here, right? It segments some things. And so there's form and there's function to that. But we want to go beyond that. So if it's not a purely functional modulation where we just get from point A to point B, what is it? And letter B, I think an advanced modulation really shows an understanding of the context. Now, Many times we have heard modulations that kind of make us jerk and go, what just happened? Because they're too abrupt and they're out of context, meaning you might have been going along in this flowing, broken, rolling chord pattern in your left hand, or even just doing, you know, broken cascading 16th notes in your right hand, whatever it happens to be. And then all of a sudden you throw in these block chords and everybody knows exactly what happens. And so it ruins the flow because it's too abrupt. The other thing a lot of modulations tend to do is they're too long. And so any energy that you've built up through the course of your arrangement, the course of your accompaniment, is lost. It's like when you open that cap on that carbonated beverage. If you don't open it all the way, you just let that fizzle out. All the energy just it dissipates. And so you could be going along, and the worst place to do this is coming out of a bridge, coming from the second to last chorus. We loop around and come to the last chorus, right? We're really driving for that apex, that climactic point of the song. And then we take 8 bars to change keys. And everybody's just sitting there like, wow, that would have been great, except we took too long. So an advanced modulation really pays attention to the context. How fast do I need to change keys? Now, the faster we need to change keys, the shorter that modulation needs to be. If we've got time between verse 1 and verse 2, then we can make it a little bit more melodic, and we can make it a little bit more fancy, if you will, from a melody standpoint. Not only does it show an understanding of the context, but I think it utilizes all 3 aspects of music. Oftentimes, and I alluded to this earlier, we focus on aspect number 2, which is purely harmony. And when we first teach modulation, whether it's in a Bible college setting or if I'm in a private studio setting, I teach it from a harmonic standpoint. I take a couple things out of play. I take melody out of play, and I take rhythm out of play. Because what I'm really asking people to do is play a little bit by ear, which scares a lot of people. And so we focus mainly on the harmony. And I think of it this way. I think of building a structure where you frame in your walls, you've got your 2x4s, and that's it. That's your harmonic structure. Now the question is, can we put the melody and the rhythm back on the sheetrock or the covering, and then paint the wall and hang decorations on the wall and make it look all fancy like Mrs. Raver's living room? I mean, I need that background for my music lessons, right? The guitar, at least Adam's not there, so that's good. Ruger would be a nice welcome. She has the most adorable dog. But we can fancy things up, right? We can hang things on the structure. So we have to utilize both the melody and the rhythm aspect of the modulation. So that's kind of what I view as an advanced modulation, what we're going to talk about here secondly, as we move to masking a modulation. How do we hide the fact, if you will, that we are changing keys? Now, why on earth would we want to do that? Jonathan, what do you think? Why would we want to hide the fact that we're changing keys?
I guess in certain times when you're accompanying people, you just want it to be one flowing line. You don't want it to be 2 separate things.
Exactly. It adds that cohesion, right? And so instead of being chopped up and segmented in different portions with, like we described earlier, that commercial break in between, right? All this time, in a book I've been working on, and we talked a little bit back when I was down there last year at Crown and did the workshop about interludes and introductions and transitions. I get asked all the time, what do I do between verses? What do I do between choruses? How do I segue when I have to make up all this material? Well, this is a little bit, this entails that. Where do I get this stuff to make my modulation beautiful? So number 2 in masking a modulation, letter A, it says masking makes the listener continue to listen through the modulation by providing content worthy of their attention. You give them something worth listening to. And masking utilizes melody and rhythm to hide or mask the essential harmonic structure of the modulation. Okay, that's all the nuts and bolts of it. You are welcome. I will see you guys next time. No, letter B is really going to get into this nitty gritty. How do we do that? And this is where we're really going to start to mess around with some things. The first thing is the melody. If you want to hide your modulations, you have to put a melody to it. And I know for a lot of people, that part is scary. Like where I had a lesson this afternoon with a gal, and we talked about where melody comes from. And you remember this from your theory textbook. A good melody, number one, it usually is based on a chord member and its neighbor tones. You remember the upper and lower neighbor from the non-chord tones that we studied in the theory textbook. You've got a melody that's based on a chord member. That's a comforting and reassuring fact, right? There's not 88 note choices. There's not even 12 note choices when you consider the chromatic steps or the half steps. There's not. There's 3, maybe 4 note choices from a chord, 4 if you're dealing with a 7th chord. And then beyond that, you start to use some passing tones or some neighbor tones to get between those chord members. So if I'm in the key of E flat and I'm playing an E flat chord, my melody is going to consist probably of an E flat, a G, or a B flat. It takes a little bit of the guessing game out of it. Now, remembering that a good melody will move mostly stepwise and that it will leap usually to another chord member, I can begin to explore around the outline of my triad. And there you have just a basic melody. And for some of you, that's totally natural. You just sit down, you play things, and they come out. We don't like you, Jonathan, that it just comes so naturally. No, I love Jonathan. Jonathan and I share the same birthday, and I have known him since he was 8 when we first started lessons together. So if I pick on Jonathan, that is why. But for some people, it just comes naturally. And for other people, you're just like, I can't do this. Start with your chord and see if you can just walk between chord members, and maybe something comes to mind. As you're dealing with melodic interest, it's also nice, and I love to do this, to incorporate a 2nd or a 7th of a chord. So for example, let's stay in the key of E flat. I'm going to use the 7th from an E flat chord, which is a D. And I'm going to couple that with a couple other chord members, the E flat and the B flat mainly. And you're going to end up with something like this. That's it. And so now you have a basic melody. I can take that melody, and later you'll see that we talk about these progressions. I'm going to take that melody and I'm going to put that melody on top of a 1 chord, a 4 chord, a 1 first inversion, and then I'm going to resolve it for a 5 chord, and you're going to have an introduction. Okay, 3 notes sequenced together on top of a chord progression, and you have a melody. So that was the 7th. You can also use the 2nd. The 7th can be added if you like that kind of an angsty sound. It's a little bit, I don't know. I describe it as an it's not like totally consonant. It's a little bit dissonant. Sometimes you like that. I prefer a little bit dissonance because it makes the consonants so much better. But that's just me personally. I had a theory teacher way back who hated my arrangement of Amazing Grace because it had 7ths in it, and I put it in 4/4, so I was 2 strikes down already. You can also put the 2nd. But this is free. In congregational hymn playing, when you feel like you can't change anything, you can always add a 2nd because it doesn't change the harmonic structure of the chords. So back in E flat, I'm going to add an F to this chord, and you can hear it kind of adds a little, I don't know, shimmer sound to it. But that F gives me kind of a good launching point. And I can use that as a 4th note to build some melodic interest. So if you're wondering what can I do to build a melody, you might even just start with those chords. And a simple trick to building a melody, whether you're building one or whatever you're trying to do to mask your modulation, is to borrow existing melody. Now that doesn't always work. If the existing melody is boring, please don't borrow that. But for example, I'm going to borrow this very common theme, right? And I'm going to, let's just go up a half step. I'm going to go from G to A flat, and I'm going to use this. Right? And so you were taken on the journey and not just put on pause, because what were you all singing in your mind? Amazing, great, right? And you just continue along that journey. So you can borrow from that existing melody. I like to, if I'm going to use melodic structure from my existing melody to modulate, I like to use some type of motive out of my existing melody that's based on a one chord. So that Amazing Grace follows our melody rules. If we're leaping within the outline of a triad, D, G, B, G, B. I'm going to follow those rules, and I'm going to use that because it's based on a one chord. And I could put all kinds of things under that, which we'll talk about later. But you can go world's most famous chord progression, 1, 6, 4, 5. You know it, right? That's not what you all signed up to learn tonight. I'm going to take that melody and I'm going to put that on top of that progression. I'm going to go G, E minor, C, probably turn it to C7, and then D suspension, D suspension resolved to D. So right, and then all of a sudden we have this melody that we can use. In my favorite type of modulation, which we'll talk about in just a second, is the sequential modulation. So we're going to start thinking about using the melody. The other thing that we're going to use to mask a modulation is the rhythm, because letter C, the rhythm makes the listener think and it keeps their mind engaged. So if you lose your listener, you're done for, right? My teacher used to tell me this: if I can't make them listen within the first 4 bars of a song, I've lost them. Well, the same thing is true, is that if I keep them through the first verse and then I lose them in the interlude, I'm not getting them back, right? You know how easy it is to get distracted when you're listening to someone play, and then next thing you know, they're 3/4 of the way through and you're like, oh, I missed all of that. And we missed enjoying it. We missed the blessing. And sometimes we just look like we're not very kind because we're not paying attention. So we have to do everything we can to keep that listener engaged. And it also makes us be more engaged because we don't fall into this rut of, excuse me, while I change keys, using a 4/5 to 5 or 5 sus. So mimicry does wonders. We just illustrated that a little bit with Amazing Grace. But we can do it with Jesus Loves Me. That rhythm, da 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 da, of 4/8 notes. And then we could go. Now, at any point, did I actually play the legit melody to Jesus Loves Me? Like twice, right? But what did I do? I kept the rhythmic concept going. I kept the rhythmic idea going, so that in your mind, whether you liked it or not, you were just manipulated into going, Jesus loves me, Jesus loves me, Jesus loves me. And then we don't know what to sing for the last word because we have to resolve. So I kind of hung it out to dry there. But does that make sense, how you can use that rhythm to bring your listener along? That's what we're talking about. If you can bring your listener across that divide between the end of section A and the beginning of section B, now all of a sudden they're enjoying the journey instead of, and no, that was not a veiled reference to Evangelist Scott Pauley's podcast, although it's a good one. They're enjoying the journey across that divide rather than just tuning out and getting lost. So we're going to use rhythm, whether it happens to be Jesus Loves Me or it happens to be and I realize I haven't changed keys yet, but that's okay. I could do the same thing. I'm going to go from E flat to, let's go to G. I'm going to use the minor 2, which is A minor, and then I'm going to go to D for the 5. So I'm going to use 2 to 5 in my new key. And I'm going to go from, I'll probably go from E flat to E flat over G. But I'm going to use that same rhythm. That was the wrong chord. Right? And so it keeps you a little bit engaged. Now, was that as masked as it could be? Of course not. We could get a little bit more complex than that, but we're just building step by step. So use rhythm, use melody. Now let's get into the fun stuff. Let's look at the back page for just a second. Types of modulation. There's some cool things in here that will let you mask. There are some things in here that you already know. We talked about letter A, the 5/7. Why would you use the 5/7? It's the most simplest, most bland form of modulation possible. However, it is the quickest way to get somewhere. So let's say you're coming out of the bridge and you're about to go into the chorus for that final last hurrah. And you know, the automatic amen is to put that key change in there. And that's just when everybody just loses their mind. And so you come out of the bridge. This isn't really a bridge, but you get the idea. Right? And I use the 5/sus, but that's the concept, is I have to change fast so that I can keep my energy going. That's when you'd use letter A and letter B, that V7 and that V-sus, that 5/sus. And it works great for half step and it works great for whole step. I didn't put this in there, but I'll plug this right now. What modulation you choose has a lot to do with your environment. So say, for example, you're soloing on a piano. It's limitless. You can go from one key to any key. But let's say you're accompanying a vocalist. Please don't take them up a sixth or down a third. They're not going to love you. Very rarely are you going to take a vocalist farther than a whole step. It's just not going to happen unless you have a really narrow range of a melody. Then you have a little bit more freedom. But for the most part, you're not going to take them way high or way low in a solid jump. There are some exceptions to this. In fact, Calvary Covers It All uses there's an excellent pivot tone modulation, letter E, for Calvary Covers It All. And if I forget that, somebody can remind me, and when we get there, I'll talk about that. So letter A and letter B, you're going to use these when you've got to go fast and you're playing along and right, and you've just got to knock it out of the park. Now, let me say this. Even this movement right here, what am I doing to the listener's ear? Hanging them out to dry or grabbing them by the hand and saying, come along with me. I'm about to give you a note that's non-diatonic, but I need it to sound diatonic, right? Why do we not use augmented intervals in melody writing? Anybody? Wow, active participation here. Appreciate that. Because they're hard to hear and they're hard to sing. We also don't sing major sevenths a lot. They're hard to sing. You can't pick those out harmonically. Now, if you've had years and years of training and you're one of those people that can identify polytones because you have perfect pitch, more power to you. But the average person is not going to sing that interval. They're not going to sing a tritone. Right? There's a reason it doesn't go, the hills are alive with the sound of music. Those hills were dead. Okay? It just doesn't work that way. Because of that, that principle carries over with our voice leading. I'm not going to go from a C or an E to a D flat and take them up an octave. Now, I am going to use a C chord and I am going to go to a D flat. However, I'm going to take them this way. That's a lot easier if I take them from a C to a D flat than if I try and get them from an E to a D flat or a G to it. Does that make sense? It's about voice leading. Remember, we talked about melody. It's about moving them by steps as much as possible. You can get them to go all kinds of places if it's one little step at a time. Well, that sounds like something that's being done in our country right now. You can get people to move all kinds of places if you just feed them one step at a time. Okay, maybe not in such a positive light. Same thing is true with an ear and with a listener, with an audience. If you don't want them to have that, what just happened, did somebody hit a wrong note moment, you have to move them along stepwise. And so we move a melody. If I am going to play a C chord, and let's just say I'm playing C in root position, C, E, and G, okay? And I have to go to an E flat chord. Which inversion am I going to use to take the melody? Let's say G is my melody on my C chord, and I'm trying to get to an E flat chord. Guess which E flat chord I'm going to use? The one that has G on the top. Why? Because they're already there. So they are right in the right place to go from, okay? If I try and take them to, from this C chord with C on top, E, G, C, and I try and take them to an E flat chord, I'm not going to go to second inversion. I'm not going to go like this with the melody. I'm going to go like this. It's a much more palatable movement for the ear. So as you're dealing with these types of modulation, think about where is your melody going? Okay, I seem to get stuck on day by day a lot. Let's talk about letter C. This is probably my all-time favorite type of modulation. Now, I will warn you about this one. It is not for the preservation of energy. If you're trying to come out of that last chorus and loop around and do another chorus, don't use this one. It usually takes at least 4 to 8 measures to develop. So while I love it, it's not used in certain instances. I do use it in a couple of arrangements in my piano book, but the gist of a sequential modulation, and if I think this is in that Holly Aids choral conducting or choral arranging book. I don't know if you guys still use that down there at the college, but it might be in the theory book also. But a sequential modulation simply repeats the same set of notes into a different key. And there are specific types of sequences. There are exact sequences. I'm more interested in an approximate sequence where we get the gist, the general idea. But what happens is I'm going to look down at number 4 here for just a second, letter A. I'm going to borrow this progression right here, this 1, 4, 1 to 5. I'm going to use a 4-bar progression, and I'm going to use this in day by day. I'm going to borrow the motive from day by day, okay? And I'm going to play that on top of this progression. Let's see. Right? And then we're in the next key. 8 bars though, 8 measures. So the sequential works really well to go up a whole step. I'm not a huge fan of the sequential in a half step setting, simply because if you think about the common tones between keys that are half step apart, there's not very many. But if you think about the common tones between keys a whole step apart, there are a lot. So it's a little bit easier to take the ear on that transition when you're going from F to G, because there's still a lot in common between an F scale and a G scale, right? Only B flat and F sharp are the main difference. So I do like it in a whole step setting. That doesn't mean you can't use it in any other setting. You just have to explore. Keys that don't have a lot in common, like you're probably not going to go from B flat to E. You can try it, but you're really going to have to manipulate some things to take the ear along that journey. Can it be done? Yes. But there's not a lot going on there. If all of your flats have to become naturals, it's going to sound abrupt. So that's another thing to consider when you're doing the modulation is what is your relationship between keys. Sometimes half step is all you have, and you just have to deal with it. If you're dealing with a broad melody and you're dealing with a vocalist and they can only go so high, or you're dealing with the limitations of an instrument, you just have to deal with it. But for me, sequential works very nice up the whole step. Let's talk about D for a second. We're going to come back to C when we get to number 4, but let's talk about D for just a second. Actually, I'm going to stop right there. I've been rambling for a while. Does anybody have any questions up to this point? Jonathan, I muted you because you had like a ton of background noise. So if you have a question, you have to unmute yourself. So did we lose Casey? No, there she is. Anybody have any questions? Yes, no? Wow, you guys I must be just doing a great job then, I guess, or we're just drinking from a fire hydrant. All right, letter D, the pivot chord. What is a pivot chord? A pivot chord is a diatonic chord that is diatonic in both keys. A diatonic chord, there's a couple of different definitions, but my favorite one is diatonic means it's according to the key. So for example, an E is diatonic to the C scale. An E minor chord is diatonic to the key of C, but an E minor chord is also diatonic to the key of D. So what happens is you could be playing along, and you've done this in your theory homework, is where you have to determine where exactly the key change happened. And using a pivot chord, it happens on a chord that functions in both keys. Now, in the key of C, E is the third, it's the median. In the key of D, it's the second, it's the submedian. However, the quality is still the same, they're both minor. So you could be playing along in a progression like this. And I just used that E chord to take me from the key of C. I just went C to F, E to A7. Now, what I actually did is I used the E as a pivot chord, but that pivot chord actually allowed me to use it as the 2 of my next key. So some of these you'll find they overlap. Let's say I'm going along and I want to go from F to B flat. What's a common chord between F and B flat? There's a blatantly obvious one. It's F, right? It's the 4, or it's F and then it's the 5 of B flat. It's the 1 in F and the 5 of B flat. Now, we're going to use that, and why is this going to work? Because that common chord so happens to be, it's going to work even better because it so happens to be the 5 of our new key. And if I was to make that a 7, then it would be even better. So for example, I'm in F, and it just takes me right there. Why? Why did that not sound as blatantly key change-ish? It's because of the relationship, because I pivoted and I slightly went a different direction. And it wasn't a totally new direction because that chord functions equally in both keys. Now, it's not the 1 in the new key because there's only 1, but it was still a major quality in both keys, and it took me both places. Now, one of the things, and I'll throw this in there because I didn't really have a place for it, is when you're leaving a key, it's sometimes nice to leave the key on the same quality that you're going to enter the next key. So for example, if I'm going to use this 2 to 5 progression where I'm going to start my progression on a minor chord, I'm going to try and leave my original key on the minor chord. So let's say I'm in the key of B flat and I want to go to C. No, let's be crazy. Let's go to D, okay? And I'm going to use the 2. The 2 of D happens to be E, right? Which is minor in its quality. I'm going to play a B flat chord, and I'm going to follow that by either 2, 3, or 6, because I know I'm going to use a minor chord to get to this next key. I'm going to leave with a minor chord so that I am, not only am I going to try and use my melody and I'm going to use my rhythm to bridge that gap, I'm also going to use the quality of my chord choices. So I'm going to try and take them from a minor sound to a minor sound so it's not as abrupt. The 4/5 is a great modulation tool. It's just not easy to hide because you're playing a major sound that is blatantly not in your current key, and your ear knows that. So let's see if I can do that. I'm going to go from B flat to G, and we're going to use, I'm going to leave from D minor, and then I'm going to arrive on E minor, which is going to take me to A sus or A7, or however it ends up working out. But so if we stick with There's a Fountain, of a sudden you find yourself in the next key, but it's not super abrupt to go from here to here, to go from a minor, to leave from a minor and approach to a minor. So back to the pivot chord, it's a shared diatonic chord. Now, I didn't have space or the brain power to really break down all the ones that are like awesome. But you just have to explore with that. If you're looking for a modulation that doesn't take time to develop and something that just happens, look for a pivot chord. It's there. I didn't have to take them through this framework. It just happened, right? I just made my one chord, major minor seventh chord, and that took me up a perfect fourth. So that's that pivot chord that functions in the same key. I don't have to make it a major minor seventh chord. I'm just gonna end on G, and this G functions in my next key, which is C. Right? It takes you right there. I will resolve for those of us who are hindered by unresolved sounds. Let's talk about E. E is a modification of a pivot chord. E involves a pivot tone. So a pivot chord is something that's diatonically shared between both keys. It's in both keys. A pivot tone really zooms in a little bit more. It's a tone, one simple scale degree that happens to be in both keys. Now, there are some very specific destinations to this. I love this modulation if I have time to do it. However, I do want you to take note that the distance between these keys is not conducive to vocal performance. Please don't take your vocalist up a minor sixth or up a major sixth. Up a minor third is maybe okay. It totally depends on the song. And then the last one, which I just kind of discovered yesterday, even though I've been using it for a long time, I just never really broke it down. The last one's a little bit more functional for vocalists. But let's talk about up a minor sixth. What is the common tone between, in these two examples, C and A flat? C. All right. So this works great because if you're going to go up a minor sixth, you can just use your current key tone as a member of your next tonic, your next one chord. So let's branch out a little bit. Let's go from D to B flat, okay? And my pivot tone is going to be a D because D happens to be the third of my B flat after being the one or the tonic of my original key. So we'll use come thou fount. I didn't play any modulation progressions. I happened to, once I got to B flat, I happened to do a little interlude, but I don't have to. I just take you right there. And so I use that D, which became the third of my next chord. Jesus Loves Me, I'll go back to C and A flat. The Bible tells me so. Right? And so I replaced my final chord with the one of my new key. And the reason that worked is because my key tone could remain the same and it functioned as my pivot tone to get me into that new key. That's up the minor six. Up the major six gives you a little bit more options, but you'll notice there's a caveat to this. You have to adjust your final melody note to the third degree of the old key. So borrowing from the Jesus Loves Me example, the Bible tells me I can't end on one. Any reason? Anybody know why? You're not going to answer anyway, so I'll just tell you. It's because my C is not natural in the key of A, it's sharp. So I'm going to adjust my final melody to the third scale degree, which happens to be E. And you're in the key of A, just by that one tone. Now, you'll notice I adjusted the melody up to E, and you can come at it from the bottom, you can come at it from the top if you want to. Bible tells me so. And then you can cadence in that new key if you want to, by going 4-5-1 or 2-5-1 or 2-4-5. It doesn't matter, 4-2-5, whatever. You can do all of that in the new key before you start, or you can just go right into it, and you're in the next key because there's a relationship there and there's something in common. Calvary Covers It All uses E number 3, which is up a minor third. Actually, I lied. Calvary Covers It All uses number 1, which is up a minor 6. However, you can use it to go down a major third. Remember, an interval inverted equals 9, and it changes the quality. So a major 6 up is a minor third down. So I'm going to go from D to B flat, and Calvary covers it all, far to than, right? And because that final tonic, that key tone happened to be, and it works great on that, because Calvary Covers It All melody starts on the third, which happens to be the key tone of the key you just came from, and that works great. So I can finish, Calvary covers it all, far to than. And you can come back, actually. I don't remember how it came back. I used to do it as an arrangement with someone a long time ago. But you can get your way back. You just have to use a different form. So up a minor third from C to E flat, or from E flat to G. That's not a minor third. E flat to G flat. Oh, never mind. Sorry, Jonathan. I'm not changing keys to G flat. Let's go from F to A flat. You can totally do this. Notice again, your melody has to be adjusted. Letter E, number 3, this time to the 5th of the old key. So instead of ending on F, I'm going to end on C, which is going to allow me to play an A flat chord to go with that. So let's use God Leads Us Along. And you're just right there. So you can, like I said, you can cadence if you want to, or you can just do that weird thing where you make the listener sing the last word instead of playing it. And then they have to catch up and figure out where the words are. So it's kind of becomes implied as you dovetail the end of one song and the beginning of the next song together. Now, number 4 is something I was just thinking about the other day. A lot of you have heard any arrangement of I Stand Redeemed. And in the chorus, it goes up a whole step. And I started looking at that and I thought, well, that's really interesting. The chorus goes. changes keys, and it just goes. And so I started looking at that, and I discovered it's up a whole step. And what happens is the melody adjusts to the third degree of the old key, and then you put over it, or you put that new melody note over the 5 or the 5 sus or the 5 7s, totally up to you, of the new key. Then, if you're still with me at that point, you can use a 1 chord or even a 4/5 to 1 in the new key. So I'm going to try and remember how I did this with God Leads Us Along, but I'm going to start by adjusting my melody at the end up to an A, because I'm in the key of F, so that's the 3rd scale degree. But instead of playing an F chord with that, I am going to play, no, that doesn't work. I am going to adjust my melody. Oh yeah, I'm going to adjust my melody in A, and I'm going to go to the 5 of my new key, which happens to be D. God leads his dear children along. Sorry, that took me to D. That didn't get me there. Let me try that one more time. And now I'm going to play 4/5, which happens to be C over D. And now I am up a whole step. So that's kind of a unique way to get up a whole step, if you can deal with that adjusted melody. So this is 5. You could also use this as 1, but that just takes me up a major 6. So it's kind of the same thing as number 2, except instead of using that key tone as part of my new tonic, I'm using it as my new 5, which is why I'm probably going to use the 5 sus followed by the 5 7. And that takes you to the next key. Now, none of that is nearly as exciting as the next 2 I just. The next 2 are probably the first functional key changes that we talk about. The 2 to 5, or the 2 to 5 sus to 5, letter F, or letter G, the 4 over the 5, remember that's the 4 octaves, 4 chord over the 5 octaves, followed by a 5 chord, that key change that we all just default to when we don't want to think. So those are other options that you can use. Now, let's see if we can mask a 4/5 to 5 key change. Actually, let's do this. For letter F, if you feel so inclined to make a note of this, I prefer to use the 2 to 5 if I'm going from a soft song to another soft song. But if I need to be bombastic and keep my energy going, I'll use the 4/5 just because it's a brighter sound. That doesn't mean you can't use the 2 to 5. It's just not nearly as exuberant, if you will. So let's see if we can use the 2 to 5 to change keys and see what happens. Somebody who still has a mic on, pick a hymn. Don't everybody join in at once.
Constantly Abiding.
Oh, thank you. I believe that's in D flat. Okay, so we'll go Constantly Abiding, and we'll just go up a half step. No, we'll go up a whole step to E flat, and let's see. We're going to see if we can use this melody, this motive, to change keys. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to leave my D flat, and I'm going to go to some chord that is going to, quality-wise, marry up to the 2 chord in my next key, which is F minor. So I'm either going to play F minor, which is the 3 chord of my current key, or I'm going to play E flat minor, which is the 2 chord of my current key, or I'm going to play B flat minor, which is the 6th of my current key. But one of those ways, I'll probably do B flat minor because it's really easy to just do that. And then I'm going to aim for F minor and follow that up with a 5 B flat suspension chord. And let's see what happens. What song, Caleb? Oh, Constantly Abiding. And I lied. I added a couple of extra chords in there. But did you see how we worked our way around to get to that 2 chord? The other thing that I failed to mention is that you want your modulations, if you're going to be a lengthy modulation, it has to make phrase sense. You can't just throw 3 random chords together all in half notes and just 6 beats somewhere. It has to be. So when we first teach modulation, I take the rhythm thought out of it and I tell everybody, I don't care what key signature, I don't care what time signature you're in, we're changing in 4/4 and these are the chords we're using, because I don't want them to have to worry about changing keys into 9/8, Blessed Assurance, or in this case 12/8, Constantly Abiding, or the chorus is 12/8 and then 9/8 for the verse. I don't want to have to worry about that. But if I'm just going to play, I'm going to play in 2 to 4, probably not 8 measures, but 2 to 4 measure sections. And honestly, what did I use to tie all that together? Not necessarily a chord progression, but I kept the same melodic rhythm, as if you weren't going to tell if I was going to play the same verse again. And I did. Because I couldn't think of anything else to play, so I just kept playing the verse. Peace in my heart, that the one never gave, peace that could not fail. And so guess where your ears went? Whether I was playing the right melody or not, they were singing the words. Does that make sense? Because you're taking them on a journey. And next thing you know, you're in the next key. Now, they got halfway through the journey and I kicked them out and said, we're not singing those words, come back we're going to start the verse again. But they at least came on the journey. So you can use, all I did was take, I think of what I used. There's a peace in my, I went 1 to 3 to 4 to 2. And then I went to 2 of the next key, 2, 7 in the next key, 5 sus. And next thing you know, we're on this journey. And it's not as much about hiding the fact that I'm changing keys. It's about getting them across the bridge and then them looking back and realize you took me across the bridge. Rather than them not knowing at all that the bridge was there, but knowing after the fact, because then they're still with me and I can continue to take them. Now, what I just played involves number 4, which I hope that you will take these. These are just 4 measure chord progressions, or 8, depending on how long you make each chord list, that are useful for sequential modulations. You can plug these into letter C and you can repeat them up a whole step. For example, let's take letter D, which is no, that's the heart and soul progression. Let's take letter B, 1 to 4 to 2, 7 to 5, and I'll probably put 5 sus in there. And I'm gonna use that, and I'm just gonna sequentially change keys. So let's say I will take Constantly Abiding, since that seems to be Caleb's favorite song. So we gotta finish the song. 4, 7, or 2, 7, 5 sus. And I played the same exact progression up a half step, and I didn't like it because it was up a half step, but it just took you along. It's the same 4 chords, basically the same melody if I had tried to think about it, but I just went with whatever melody came out of those chords. but tried to keep my pinky moving stepwise in my right hand so that I could keep the listener going. And then take you to a destination that's explosive as I'm ramping you up. If I can lead you every step of the way to that destination and drop you off safely, I know that you've continued the journey with me. I'm going to do that same thing again roughly, but this time I'm going to go up a whole step just so you can hear the difference. 4. And next thing you know, you're in the next key. But it doesn't have to be big. It can also be. And then you can start wherever you happen to be. So you can use a sequential modulation to drive forward. I wouldn't use it at the end of a bridge because it just takes too long. But if you're going from third verse, you know how we do it: first verse, chorus, second verse, third verse. I would use it there. If I wanted to keep the energy going, make my third verse bigger. So there are all kinds of kind of fun progressions in this fourth section. 1 4 1 5 1 4 2 7 5, which we just played. 1 4 5 sus 5. Honestly, any of the fives can be turned into 5 sus if you want to, and then resolve to the 5. 1 6 4 5 D. 1 3. We don't use 3 a lot just because for some reason we don't. At least I don't anyways. 1 3 4 5 is a little bit interesting. It allows you to walk up in your bass line. And then you're in the next key. So that's 1 3 4 5. This next one is really interesting. 5 and 6, or sorry, F and G are interesting because they don't start on 1. So it's kind of fun to deceptively cadence at the end of a song and make that 6 chord the beginning of this progression. So you can do 2 things. You can bookend your progression, so you finish your song and then start one of these fill progressions, or you can make your final chord the first chord of your fill progression. It totally depends on how you want to do it. So let's say I took Constantly Abiding. We'll go from D. I'm going to try and go up a third. Let's go a minor third. Let's go from D to F because I just refuse to play an E because I do. Not because I can't. Well, kind of, because I don't like to. So I'm going to go from D to F, and I'm going to use this F progression here, 6 to 4 to 2 to 5, and I'm going to deceptively end. And now I'm going to go to 6 of F, which happens to be. Trying to think on the fly and talk at the same time. I didn't like that one as much just because there's not a lot in common between D and F. If I was to do, let me do a more palatable one. Let's go from F to G. Whole steps, key relations are much more enjoyable. So I will go 6, which is D minor, followed by 4, which is B flat, and so on. Here's my deceptive. And here's my 2. Now I'm going to go to 6 of G minor to 4 to 2. bit of a fresher take on a sequential modulation to go minor into your next key using the six. We don't often jump ship from a six chord into a six chord. So the next one's just a modification of that. The only reason I use the one first inversion is because of the bass line here. I like the way the four steps down to the one first inversion. So if I'm in C, so here's Bible tells me so. And then I want to go to D. It just avoids me having to use the one first inversion right away. If you think one chords are boring, I would suggest that you don't use them until the end of a section. Try and always use the 1/6 instead. Even in hymn playing, unless I'm starting off with a one chord, which we usually do, I'll use that in root position, and then I won't use a root position one chord again until I get to a cadence point, whether it's the end of a verse or the end of a chorus. But if you use that first inversion, now all of a sudden it gives new life to the one chord because your bass feels like it's reached home. Nothing's worse than singing a bass line that just is, right? We wish that they would have written something like that instead. So those are kind of the fill progressions. This weird paragraph at the bottom, you can use these same progressions to form a quasi sequential modulation. Now, what do I mean by that? It means it doesn't have to be perfect. Again, it's just a tool to grab your listener and drag them along. The quasi sequential modulation, where the first progression, the first four chords in the old key, and then you use a different one of these fill progressions to do the new key while still maintaining that sequence, that quasi sequence in melody and rhythm. So I'm going to do, I do this one all the time without thinking about it. I'm going to go A to B. 1, 4, 1, 6, 5, sus. And I just went up a half step. But I use 1, 4, 2, 7, 5 the second time. So you don't necessarily have to pick one and then use it the second time. You can explore putting these together, and you'll have 8-bar or 8-measure progressions depending on how long you do it. Sometimes you end up putting these progressions twice. So you do 2 A's, and then you could do 2 A's in the new key, 2 A's, 2 B's in the new key, just depending on what's going on. So. You're in the next key. So you can, depending on how fast you're going, you can put them, you can stack them, do them 2 times. So there's some types of modulation. If you don't get anything out of this, get this. Take your existing modulations that you're comfortable doing and see if you can add both a melodic and a rhythmic aspect to it that makes it something for the ear to latch onto.